All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jen. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. And thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn Living on the Edge in New England, New Netherland, and New Sweden. Our presenter today is Elizabeth Hines. She is an Axon Johnson Institute for Statecraft and Diplomacy postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. She received her PhD in history from the University of Chicago in 2024, and her work has been supported by institutions including the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium, the American Historical Association, and the Omohundro Institute, and she has held fellowships at the British Library, the New Netherland Institute, and the Huntington Library. And Elizabeth was recently here at the museum doing research, so we're really excited to hear about her findings. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you confirm again that it worked properly? Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me also, there we go. All right, thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to speak to you about boundary setting and the English, Dutch, and Swedish empires in early North America. This talk is based on research I conducted through the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium this spring and summer. The NERFC supported research trips for me to the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, the Massachusetts Historical Society, Harvard Divinity School Library, and the Rhode Island Historical Society. These archives and libraries hold documents from the 17th century that help explain the development of the early European empires in North America. This talk will investigate some of the entanglements between these empires. So like all good neighbors, colonial neighbors often quarreled about the boundaries between their lands. The English colonies of New England and the Dutch colony of New Netherland argued over the borders between them for years. In 1638, a Dutchman wrote to the governor of New Netherland that the English come much too high up and too near to us. In 1647, Theophilus Eaton, the governor of New Haven, wrote to Petrus Stuyvesant, the new governor of New Netherland. He said, "I hereby witness against your unneighborly and injurious course about the boundaries." And then in 1649, the governing body of New Netherland sent a delegation all the way back to the Netherlands to request a solution to the question of the border, among some other concerns. New Netherland and the New England Confederation finally settled the boundaries between them the next year in 1650 with the Treaty of Hartford. The Connecticut Museum contains a rare copy of this treaty from the 1660s. It's labeled Translation, West India Company's Grant for New Netherland and Treaty of Limits, 1650. Here on the screen, we have two signs commemorating the treaty today in the town of Huntington. Treaties and boundary making, particularly in colonial contexts, have received scholarly attention for what they can reveal about the ways different groups of people thought about territory, property, and ownership. The Hartford Treaty and its history are particularly interesting for what they can reveal about the way Europeans thought about empire and the relationship between different parts of empire. When the North American colonists sent the Hartford Treaty back across the Atlantic, the government in England didn't give it any kind of official validation, nor did any institution in the Netherlands for the first 4 years. But in 1654, the Dutch West India Company wrote to the States General, the governing body of the Netherlands. The company recommended the treaty's boundaries as the best settlement for the colony. The States General then resolved in the treaty's favor in 1655. Then they officially ratified the treaty a year later in 1656. Today, I'm going to talk about the questions of why they did so. What made the treaty so important in 1656? Why didn't anyone in England ratify the treaty? And what can this incident tell us about early imperialism in North America and the Atlantic? In the past, historians haven't discussed the Hartford Treaty very much. When they do, they tend to focus on England and the Netherlands back in Europe. But I argue that looking only at Anglo-Dutch relations obscures the broader context of imperial expansion in this period. In order to understand the 1656 ratification of the Hartford Treaty, we need to include the Swedish Empire and Anglo-Dutch-Swedish relations in the analysis. This talk argues it was the place of New Netherland, New England, and the Swedish colony of New Sweden within the extended Dutch Empire that determined the Dutch resolution on the Hartford Treaty in 1655 and ratification of the treaty in 1656. As a quick preview of the argument, my research shows that difficulties in other colonial territories around the world prompted the Dutch West India Company to order the takeover of New Sweden. The Dutch States General only resolved in favor of the Hartford Treaty after the West India Company directors had written to New Netherland with the directions to attack New Sweden. Resolving in favor of the Hartford Treaty helped secure New Netherland's northeastern border before the colony tried to take over its southwestern neighbor. The States General then ratified the Hartford Treaty after New Netherland's victory. So ratifying the treaty then protected a Dutch colony that was now surrounded by English colonies on both sides. They also hoped it would help protect them against potential attacks from indigenous neighbors. I'll get into all of this in much more detail. So in the talk, I'll first address the setting of the Dutch, English, and Swedish empires in North America. I'll argue that their entanglement contributed to Dutch and English interest in claiming the territory of New Sweden. Second, I'll show that this interest helps explain the negotiations for the Hartford Treaty and its settlements. Third, I'll trace the diplomatic negotiations about the treaty and show that many people in Europe worried about it in the first half of the 1650s. Fourth, I'll talk about the debates in New Netherland and New England about attacking and taking over both each other and New Sweden. Fifth, I'll show that events all over the world caused problems between the Dutch and Swedish empires in North America. And finally, I'll argue that what made the Dutch ready to resolve on the treaty in the winter of 1655 was the increasing struggle throughout the Dutch Empire. And what made them ready to ratify the treaty in 1656 was New Netherland's victory over New Sweden and the need for new protection. All of this will be in the next 40 minutes. So let's zoom in on North America. By the middle of the 17th century, European colonies had proliferated along the Atlantic coast. I'm going to map here dots broadly representing the European colonies I'll be talking about in the regions people now know as New England and the Mid-Atlantic. You can see New Netherland in the middle in orange, in what is now the area of New York. New Netherland was bordered by 5 different English colonies to the north and east: New Haven, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts Bay, and Plymouth. It was bordered by the small Swedish colony of New Sweden to the south and west. We hear much less about New Sweden than we do about all the early English colonies. My talk today will hopefully help rectify that. Back to the map, 2 more English colonies were located south of New Sweden. First we have Maryland, which was still very small at this time, and then we have Virginia. There were a lot more English colonies in North America than Dutch or Swedish colonies, but they each belonged to separate companies. New Netherland had been founded by the Dutch West India Company. This was a much larger organization than any of the individual English companies. In addition to New Netherland, the West India Company held territory in the Caribbean, South America, and the west coast of Africa. But of course, these colonies were not nice round dots. Their borders were contentious. The Connecticut Museum of Culture and History holds a variety of colonial patents from the early 17th century that show debates over land. For example, one patent gives what is now mostly Connecticut personally to James Hamilton, the Marquess of Hamilton, in 1635. Another patent, whose first page is broken off, seems to be giving Long Island to another nobleman in the same year. But we know that other colonies, including New Netherland, claimed the territory at the same time. So first, let's focus on New Sweden. The colony's origins were both Dutch and Swedish. Willem Usselinx, pictured here, was a Dutchman who had famously lobbied for the creation of the Dutch West India Company. He helped found a trading company called the Swedish South Company in 1626. From the beginning, the company had Dutch funding and some Dutch personnel. 2 other Dutchmen founded a similar company called the Swedish Shipping Company. The two companies combined into a larger Swedish South Company in partnership with the Swedish crown in the 1630s. In the year 1638, the Swedish South Company set out a venture that landed on what they called the South River. We now call it the Delaware River. The Swedish South Company founded the colony that became New Sweden. The colony's first governor was Peter Minuit, pictured here, and he'd previously served as the governor of New Netherland. While he was governor, he famously purchased the island of Manhattan from the Lenape people for 60 guilders, or about 6 pounds of English money. Now, Willem Usselincx and some other Dutchmen spent time trying to convince the Dutch and Swedish governments to merge the Dutch West India Company and the Swedish South Company. They thought that the Dutch and Swedish empires would benefit from working together. Dutch, Swedish, and English people thought of empire expansively in this period, which set the scene for their relations with each other on the eastern coast of North America. In these years, claims to New Netherland and New England overlapped as well. Sierra Dixon at the Connecticut Museum helped me find an article in the Connecticut Historical Society Bulletin from 1952 that had really helpful detailed evidence for the Dutch claim to Hartford. Some Dutch and English people also lived in each other's territories. Most of the English settlement in New Netherland came from the Puritan colonies of New England. People who struggled with the strict Puritan rules either left voluntarily or found themselves expelled. Many of them hoped for a more peaceful life with their lenient neighbors to the south. Famous examples of this phenomenon are Anne Hutchinson, pictured here, Deborah Moody, and John Throckmorton. Dutch people lived in New England, too, many of them in the Connecticut and New Haven colonies. Some were also in their predecessor colonies. The Connecticut Museum holds documents signed by George Fenwick that record the assumption of Saybrook Colony into Connecticut Colony. And then there are letters in the Willis Papers, some of which I've pictured here, that show Fenwick leasing land afterward. So some Dutchmen changed residency of colonies in such ways. A few Dutchmen also moved to Rhode Island. Like New Netherland, Rhode Island was a place where people often immigrated when they became unwelcome in their original colony for religious or other reasons. I learned from the first book of the Town Records of Warwick at the Rhode Island Historical Society that one of the founding fathers of the Rhode Island town of Warwick was actually Dutch. His name was Jan Gerardi. Both Dutch and English people also settled in New Sweden. It's important that both the Dutch and the English in North America felt that the territory of New Sweden should rightly be theirs. This letter at the Connecticut Museum from John Winthrop to Willem Kieft, the governor of New Netherland, in 1643, says, "Our confederates at New Haven have complained now to us of many injuries received at Delaware Bay. They have showed us their just title to the lands in question by several deeds of purchase from the Indian proprietors." Soon after the Swedish South Company arrived, Kieft told the governor of New Sweden that the entire South River of New Netherland has been for many years in our possession and secured above and below by forts and sealed with our blood. I'll talk more about the forts soon. A few years later, Governor Stuyvesant wrote to William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, that he'd heard a general rumor that runs here of a considerable company of your countrymen that intends to settle at the South River, otherwise called Delaware, a place we not only pretend unto, but have lawful right. Here we have William Bradford, whom I'm sure the audience is familiar with. Stuyvesant took the threat seriously enough to also write to his representative in New Sweden to warn them of the supposed English attack. He saw the threat of English gains on the South River as a serious one. The indigenous peoples living in the area of the South River, specifically the Lenape and the Susquehannock, were an important part of these relations. I struggled to find paintings of their leaders from the mid-17th century, so this is a later mural of the Swedish settlers meeting Lenape people. Both Dutch and English people supported their claims to territory in New Sweden with documentation of purchases from different Native American figures. Historians have shown that the colony of New Sweden was so small that the groups of indigenous people with whom the settlers traded usually held more power in their interactions. Many historians have also written about the importance of relations with indigenous peoples to the history of New England and New Netherland overall. When the representatives from New England and New Netherland considered the Hartford Treaty, they had in mind not only their Dutch and English neighbors, but also their Swedish and indigenous neighbors. When the leaders of New Netherland and New England began corresponding about setting up a commission to settle their territorial boundaries, they were not just concerned about the dividing line between them on the Hudson River, or what the Dutch called the North River. Both parties also wanted to include the question of the South River and New Sweden. The directors of the Dutch West India Company wrote to Stuyvesant in 1648 that, long ago an occasion ought to have been found to determine the boundary lines between the English, the Swedes, and ourselves. They included all three colonial groups in their call to action. After many letters back and forth, New Netherland and the New England Confederation decided to nominate representatives who would negotiate in the town of Hartford, Connecticut in the fall of 1650. Unsurprisingly, the New England Confederation nominated 2 Englishmen. More surprisingly, New Netherland nominated 2 Englishmen as well. Governor Stuyvesant of New Netherland made the determination. He chose George Baxter and Thomas Willett, 2 Englishmen with questionable reputations. Baxter served as Stuyvesant's English secretary. His brother, Thomas Baxter, was a notorious privateer. Thomas Willett was a business associate of both of theirs. Legal records show he had once drunkenly attacked a group of Dutchmen during a dinner with Thomas Baxter. Stuyvesant, pictured here, wrote of them that I make choice of my worthy friends, and that he made his decision confiding in their wisdom, integrity, and sufficiency. As a gesture of goodwill to the English, it worked. Governor Eaton wrote to Stuyvesant that he approved of the choice of arbiters. After further negotiations, they finally settled the boundaries between New England and New Netherland in the Treaty of Hartford on September 19, 1650. Although some people were relieved to have it settled, some Dutchmen thought the English had gotten a better deal. They blamed the Englishmen representing New Netherland at negotiations. First, let's see where that boundary line was, referencing the copy of the treaty at the Connecticut Museum. I've mapped the division they decided on here between New Netherland and New England. The treaty specified that on the mainland, the dividing line would begin at the west side of Greenwich Bay. It would run northward for 20 miles, with Dutch territory to the west and English territory to the east. On Long Island, the dividing line would run south, from the westernmost part of the Oyster Bay, so a bit further east than the boundary on the mainland. Again, the Dutch territory would be to the west and the English to the east. The Dutch commissioners agreed not to build any house or habitation within 6 miles of the mainland line. But the numerous Dutch people already living in Greenwich were allowed to remain there while the two bodies considered their situation further. The treaty did not enforce any large ejection of people from their homes. Other articles of the treaty address specific issues, like returning fugitives to each other in the case of a particular ship. But the single longest article of the treaty addressed New Sweden, which both New Netherland and the New England Confederation were claiming. Importantly, the treaty did not settle the question. The English tried to say that they had bought the territory from the Indians, whom they affirm were the true proprietors testified by many witnesses. But the Dutch affirmed and asserted the right and title to that land as belonging to the West India Company. It's important that the treaty didn't settle it. It left both parties in status quo. This article of the treaty is one of the clues that help solve the mystery of why the West India Company and the States General would resolve in favor of the treaty and ratify it years later. New Sweden loomed large in the minds of the commissioners when they negotiated the terms for the treaty. I'm going to argue that it continued to loom large for people both in North America and in Europe in the years that followed. So the treaty was signed in 1650. From 1650 into 1651, diplomats in Europe held long negotiations about the relationship between England and the Netherlands. There had been changes in government in both states, and they wanted to work out various problems and try to cooperate as Protestant neighbors. The specific language in the Hartford Treaty shows that it was closely connected to the issues the diplomats in Europe were discussing. The Hartford Treaty ended by addressing the proposition of a nearer union of friendship and amity betwixt the English and Dutch nation in these parts. It was soon afterward that England sent ambassadors to the Netherlands proposing a nearer union, or a more strict and intimate alliance and union between the two states in Europe. The proposals for a nearer union in Europe were unusual for two sovereign states. They went beyond the usual terms people looked for in treaties, which would be an offensive and defensive alliance, that kind of thing. A union meant combining the states to some degree. Given all their commonalities, we might have expected the Netherlands and England to sign the treaty and confirm the boundaries between New Netherland and New England at the same time. We know that the Dutch negotiators repeatedly tried to bring up the Hartford Treaty, but the negotiations ran into difficulties almost as soon as they began. In general, the English ambassadors felt that the Dutch moved too slowly. The Dutch felt that the English ambassadors did nothing but pick fights. In the meantime, the States General in the Netherlands continued to debate what to do about the Hartford Treaty. A political rival of Stuyvesant's in New Netherland, Adrian van der Donck, provided the States General with a slew of materials to consider. He's pictured here. Van der Donck felt that the delegates for the Hartford Treaty negotiations had not fought enough for New Netherland's interests. He considered New Sweden to be part of those interests. He wrote, "All the arbitrators were English, and they pulled the wool over the directors' eyes." He provided a document with the title Translated News Out of New England. The unnamed narrator of the news says that at the conclusion of the Hartford Treaty negotiations, when the governor had heard the verdict, he made a great noise against his two chosen arbitrators, shouting, "I am betrayed! I am betrayed!" Whether or not Stuyvesant had really shouted that New Netherlands English representatives had betrayed him, van der Donck wanted to use this story to prevent the States General from ratifying the Hartford Treaty. He thought they shouldn't ratify it, partially because the negotiators had given in too easily about New Sweden. One of his documents for the States General, here we have an image of the States General, said that these Swedes are not possessors, but have only bought what they have there from some subjects of this state, and in our opinion, they could not claim the high jurisdiction. Not just van der Donck, but many others as well, felt that New Netherland had the strongest claim to the territory on the South River, and that New England and New Sweden would eventually have to admit it. While they disagreed on other issues, Stuyvesant and van der Donck agreed on this one. At the end of the frustrating negotiations between the Dutch and English ambassadors, the ones that didn't solve the problem of the Hartford Treaty, the First Anglo-Dutch War broke out. A fight between English General Robert Blake and Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp off the coast of Dover was the official start. Here we have an image of a famous battle from later in the war. Trade competition between England and the Netherlands, such as the competition in the herring fishery detailed in this document from the Connecticut Museum, also contributed. It turned into a naval war that the Netherlands and England fought against each other from 1652 to 1654. Now, the Hartford Treaty wasn't the most urgent issue on their diplomats' minds in these years. It's not surprising that they didn't ratify it during the war. But the evidence shows they continued to discuss it even while actively fighting each other. Among the States General's records, there are multiple collections of documents they solicited to help them decide. One interesting collection here is labeled Boundary Separation in America between the English and the West India Company, and Proposal for the Conservation of the Conquests in Brazil, 1653. It stands out that they put multiple issues around the Dutch Empire together like this. The 1653 date shows they were collecting up the documents right in the middle of the First Anglo-Dutch War. They kept thinking about New Sweden, too. The directors of the West India Company wrote to Stuyvesant in 1653 that he was to behave carefully with the Swedes on the South River. A variety of figures kept the question of the North American boundaries and New Sweden alive throughout the war. So that's what people were up to in England and the Netherlands in the first few years after the Hartford Treaty was signed. What were they doing in North America? While waiting for official ratification of the treaty, Governor Stuyvesant of New Netherland decided to take action about New Sweden. Without direct instructions from the West India Company, he went ahead and built a new Dutch fort on the South River. I've mapped here the forts that stood on the South River at different points between 1647 and 1654. I'm going to make a complicated story short, and no one needs to try to remember the names of the forts. But here we go. First, Stuyvesant abandoned a fort called Fort Nassau for a fort called Fort Beversraed. Second, the Swedes retaliated by building Fort Nyakorsholm right in front of Fort Beversraed. Finally, Stuyvesant had his representatives dismantle part of Fort Beversraed and use the materials to build Fort Casimir. So there was frequent change along the South River in these years. When they learned about it through letters, the directors of the West India Company were pleased that Stuyvesant had staked a claim with the new fort, but they were nervous that it wouldn't actually help with the ongoing boundary problems. They wrote back that, "We see little probability or any encouragement with the Swedes here that we'll be able to arrange any boundaries." A paragraph later, they wrote that with regard to the provisional boundaries with the English, we would allow ourselves to be satisfied with it, and the Lords Ambassadors, who have departed for England, also have been issued instructions to come to an agreement with the lords of the government there. This was one of many times they expressed hope that Dutch ambassadors negotiating in England would settle the boundaries with the English diplomats there. It's important to note that they usually address the two sets of boundaries, with New England and with New Sweden, together. While those in Europe fought the First Anglo-Dutch War, and those in New Netherland debated the problem of New Sweden, those in New England debated the problem of New Netherland. The English colonists in these years accused the Dutch of plotting against them with indigenous groups, including along the South River or the Delaware Valley. The Massachusetts Historical Society was one of the other archives I visited through the NERFC Fellowship. It holds the diary of John Hull. The diary provides wonderful commentary on the growing tensions between New England and New Netherland. John Hull was the mint master for Massachusetts Bay Colony. He recorded that there came intelligence of a plot between the Dutch and the Indians to cut off all the English, and great probability there was of the truth of it, though not full proof. He described the visit of two commissioners from New England to New Netherland to discuss these accusations as something that might further clear the righteousness of the war or prevent it. He was clear about the motivation of the visit because many English colonists were clamoring for war with New Netherland. They saw their neighborly quarrels as part of the broader Anglo-Dutch War, and they kept up to date on the developments of the war in Europe. Members of the Connecticut colony agitated throughout the war for an English attack on New Netherland. They said it was justified by the supposed plotting between the Dutch and indigenous groups. Members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony opposed the efforts of the Connecticut colony, but the debate continued throughout 1653 and 1654. By 1654, the government in England responded to the desires of some of these colonists and decided to extend the war to North America. They sent ships of officers and soldiers to New England to plan an attack on New Netherland. Hull recorded in his diary that they were there to root out the Dutch if they would not submit to the power and government of England. The officers aimed to recruit 500 colonists to join their forces, and they managed to gather about 100. But in the middle of their planning and recruiting, a ship arrived with news from Europe. England and the Netherlands had signed a peace treaty. The First Anglo-Dutch War was over. The attack on New Netherland was cancelled, but tension remained between the New England colonies and New Netherland. The colonists in New Netherland knew that their English neighbors could return to the idea of attacking them in the future. The English diplomats in Europe kept getting questions from their Dutch colleagues about the Hartford Treaty. They knew delaying its ratification kept open the possibility of future changes to the boundaries between the New England Confederation and New Netherland. This leads us to the question of why they ratified the treaty in 1656. I argue that the West India Company and the States General saw the treaty in terms of their broader imperial concerns in those years. They wanted to bolster New Netherland's strength during a time when other parts of the Dutch Empire were facing difficulties. Specifically, they wanted to secure New Netherland's northeastern border in order to turn to the southwest and attack New Sweden. This would expand New Netherland's territory by taking a section of land they'd always thought of as partially Dutch. It's also not a coincidence that the colony they planned to take over was Swedish. One of their imperial concerns involved Swedish forces elsewhere. The imperial issue in question was competition from the Swedish Africa Company. In 1649, the Dutchman Louis de Heer, pictured here, and his son Laurens helped found the Swedish Africa Company. They worked in partnership with the Finnish adventurer Hendrik Karloff. Karloff was a member of the Dutch West India Company, and he'd served as its tax commissioner in Guinea. He was known as an unscrupulous adventurer for hire. Louis de Heer was a prominent merchant, and he'd loaned large amounts of money to the Crown of Sweden in the 1620s and 1630s. The Swedish Africa Company and the Dutch West India Company became direct competitors in Africa. The Swedish Africa Company grew in strength during the first half of the 1650s, and the Dutch West India Company directors worried they were being edged out of their holdings on the Gold Coast. These circumstances were even worse when considered in conjunction with circumstances in Brazil. After years of fighting, Portuguese forces had definitively driven out the Dutch forces in January of 1654. News of this loss would have reached home amid bad news from the Gold Coast. I've mapped the West India Company directors' spots of concern in 1654 here. Now I want to bring back those documents that the States General had filed together in 1653. They had bound the documents they solicited about the North American boundary dispute together with documents about Brazil and how to conserve the conquests there. This suggests that they thought of these issues as connected. They had not yet lost Brazil when they compiled the documents, but they were struggling against the Portuguese there and trying to make plans for how to preserve their territory. So a potential expansion into the South River in North America could help counter some of this bad news from the Gold Coast and Brazil. The final blow came from North America itself. The Hartford Treaty had concluded its section on New Sweden with the hope that all proceedings there, as in other places, may be carried on in love and peace, till the right may be further considered and justly issued, either in Europe or here, by the two states of England and Holland. But love and peace did not carry the day. This talk has shown how tensions continued to rise regarding the territory of New Sweden between 1650 and 1654, including when Stuyvesant moved Fort Beversraid to Fort Casimir in 1651. On May 31st, 1654, Swedish forces attacked and successfully commandeered Fort Casimir on the South River from its Dutch garrison. News reached the Netherlands several months later, and the directors of the West India Company were outraged. They wrote to Stuyvesant about the violent and hostile usurpation of the Swedes there. North America had become even more of a spot of concern for the West India Company. The Swedish attack was the immediate prompt that provoked Dutch retaliation. In the very same letter, the directors of the West India Company wrote to Stuyvesant that he must do your utmost to revenge this misfortune, not only by restoring matters to their former condition, but also by driving the Swedes at the same time from the river. It was time to annex the territory of New Sweden. The directors immediately connected the potential annexation with relations between New Netherland and New England. They wrote that the attack should be easy, for your honor need not fear any other enemies there, being in peace with the neighboring English. Peace referred to the end of the First Anglo-Dutch War, which officially came in April 1654. The directors continued to discuss their plans for Stuyvesant, and a week later, they connected it to the Hartford Treaty. They wrote that, "We do here our best to obtain the long-desired settlement of the boundary between the Republic and us, at least in conformity with the provisional negotiations of 1650. The Hartford Treaty and the Dutch claim on New Sweden continued to appear in tandem in discussions about the future of the Dutch Empire. So the West India Company had decided that it was time for New Netherland to attack New Sweden. They again connected it to the boundary with New England in their letters, and soon afterward, they wrote in favor of the Hartford Treaty's provisions in a statement to the States General. This was at the very end of 1654. The States General resolved in favor of the treaty 3 days later, in early 1655. Now, there was supposed to be an attack on New Sweden right when the letters from Europe arrived, a few months after they sent them in November. But at the time, Stuyvesant was actually away on a journey to Barbados. Once he returned, his forces retook Fort Casimir on September 11th, 1655. Stuyvesant wrote proudly to the Council of New Netherland the next day that when asked by the Swedes why he had come, "To take and hold what belongs to us," was our answer. Stuyvesant then took the Swedish Fort Christina on September 15th, following which New Sweden capitulated entirely. This sounds like a great victory. But on the exact same day, a group of joint Munsee, Lenape, and Susquehannock forces raided New Amsterdam. The incident escalated into an attack known as the Peach War. A Dutch colonist later claimed that the war killed over 100 New Netherlanders and over 60 indigenous people. The traditional story is that the attack was prompted by the murder of a Munsee woman who was stealing peaches from a Dutch settler's peach tree. But some say the story might be apocryphal. Historians have debated whether the raid was related to the Dutch attack on New Sweden. The historian Cynthia Van Zandt argues that the Susquehannock and Lenape people from the Delaware Valley might have encouraged the raid for a variety of reasons. She shows how the Susquehannock and the Lenape were in many ways more powerful than the colonists of New Sweden, and she argues that they sometimes saw themselves as the colony's protectors. She finds that they saw the Dutch and Swedish colonies as interconnected, just as the Dutch and Swedish colonists did, and that they may have intended the Peach War to drive the Dutch forces away from New Sweden. The war did drive the Dutch toward New England. Stuyvesant wrote in a letter about it that he would like to enter into an offensive and defensive covenant with the English. Returning to the question of the Hartford Treaty would address his desire. In a later letter that described his triumph in New Sweden, Stuyvesant and the other signatories wrote that the boundary partition provisionally entered into at Hartford in 1650 would be very useful. The letter discussed both the Peach War and New Sweden, and the implication was that solidifying the provisions of the Hartford Treaty could help with both. Regarding the Peach War, validation of the agreement with the English could help both to protect themselves against future attacks from indigenous peoples. For New Sweden, getting official English approval could also serve as validation of New Netherland in its new form, including the former New Sweden. I've mapped here the colony's new position among the English colonies in North America, so you can see that New Netherland, now including more Swedish colonists, was now surrounded by English colonies on both sides. Confirming the boundaries with the New England colonies to the north and east would help make New Netherland's position more secure. The fact that many people had considered the treaty's provisions too favorable to the English might help, as it might make the New England colonies more likely to hold to those boundaries. They thought it might make them less likely to contemplate attacking New Netherland, the way New Netherland had attacked New Sweden. It might also make them more amenable to working together to prevent future attacks like the Peach War. The States General officially ratified the treaty on February 22, 1656. This was the final step in Dutch validation of the treaty. I've made a timeline here to show how events across the Dutch Empire, sometimes separated by a pause of a few months for news to cross the ocean, helped push for this eventual ratification. We can see how soon after news would have reached the Netherlands about the loss of Fort Casimir, the West India Company ordered the attack on New Sweden. We can see how soon after they ordered the attack, they wrote to the States General, and the States General resolved in favor of the treaty. And we can see how soon after they received news of the successful attack, plus the Peach War, the West India Company encouraged the States General to ratify the treaty, and the States General did so. The final result was the absorption of New Sweden into New England, paired with the confirmation of the boundaries between New Netherland and the New England Confederation. Repeating the language from the States General's document collection on New Netherland and Dutch Brazil, this served as conservation of the conquest. It validated New Netherland's expansion into New Sweden, and it showed the New England Confederation that the States General would underwrite New Netherland's boundaries. Building on the trans-imperial Dutch-Swedish foundations of New Sweden, the transition was a relatively smooth one. The New Netherland authorities announced that Swedish people were welcome to stay in the territory if they chose to. The West India Company directors in Amsterdam had decided on this policy from the beginning, writing in November 1654 that after the then hypothetical annexation, those of them who should desire to come under our jurisdiction may be allowed to do so. The historian Mark Meoese has written about how relations with the Susquehannock and Lenape peoples also stabilized in the short term. Many of the Swedish and Finnish settlers did choose to stay, becoming inhabitants of the expanded New Netherland. Years later, after the English annexation of New Netherland, they became inhabitants of English Delaware. People in the Delaware Valley to this day claim Scandinavian heritage and celebrate their connection to the short-lived colony of New Sweden. These are all images from a Scandinavian festival they hold regularly. This talk has argued that the States General ratified the Hartford Treaty in 1656 because of the Dutch takeover of New Sweden. Now, the fact that no institution in England ever validated the Hartford Treaty fits with the idea that ratifying treaties could help solidify claims on colonial territory. Many New Englanders reserved the hope of taking over New Netherland, even after they canceled their immediate plans in 1654, and England did not ratify the Hartford Treaty. The Dutch experience absorbing New Sweden showed them how easily a larger colonial power could claim the territory of a smaller one, so this raised the threat of the New England Confederation attacking New Netherland in the future. The threat of war with indigenous powers also loomed large throughout all these considerations. Securing the ratification of the Hartford Treaty protected New Netherland on all these fronts. How carefully the West India Company and the Dutch States General considered their endorsements, resolutions, and ratifications of the treaty shows how seriously they took the North American part of their empire. The broader imperial context of the decision to endorse the treaty shows how interconnectedly Dutch administrators thought about the empire. I'd like to suggest that we too need to think interconnectedly. In order to understand the full context of developments in English North America, we need to include the Dutch Empire too. And in order to understand New Netherland properly, we need to include the Swedish Empire. As the 250th celebration of the Declaration of Independence approaches next year and brings greater attention to the subject of early America, historians need to study all these colonies and their imperial contexts together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was amazing. Thank you. Please, if anyone has any questions, if you want to take a moment and put them in the chat, that would be great. How complex these relationships are, just a little. And of course, we forget about how large these empires are around the world, and all of those components playing into this. I had a quick question while we're allowing people time to put some questions in the chat. When you were talking about before the attack on the fort, when the Dutch attacked, were when you were talking about all the forts were moving position, was that just a tense time, or was there actually fighting, or they're just up and moving? What did that look like?
My understanding from the documents is actually that there were no official fights. There was honestly also a shortage of materials because these colonies were small and poor. And so it's not just that they wanted to build new forts, it's that they couldn't afford to get all new materials. And so they had to make strategic decisions about removing materials from one in order to position another in a more strategic position. But it was not until 1655 that there was real official fighting. There may have been small skirmishes like we see in the legal records about people getting drunk. Uh, but I also should be clear that there wasn't that much fighting in the takeover of New Sweden because actually they showed up with some really large cannons, and the Swedish garrison thought about it and decided we're definitely going to lose. We're going to surrender instead.
Wise choice. We have a question from Joyce. First, she says, thank you very much. There's several thank yous. But she's curious to what extent the upstate New York Dutch played a role in some of these issues.
Oh, that's a great question. I love thinking about New Netherland more broadly. And of course, we can talk about the patronships in this period and all of the different places people were living, including Rensselaerswyck, which we now think of as Albany. Uh, Honestly, they were mostly concerned with some local issues at this time. So while they contributed to the larger discussions in New Netherland, like the Nine was a council of men that met regularly in New Amsterdam in the capital, they were not, as far as I know, uh, they didn't say bring in troops from Rensselaerswyck for this attack on New Sweden. But it's a great reminder that New Netherland is larger than people think, and it's not just that dot on what is now Manhattan. There were things in all around what we now think of as New York and its surrounding states. And so I showed some things about Swedish heritage in the Delaware River Valley. There's lots of awesome material about Dutch heritage in what's now New York.
Interesting. We have a question from Don. Any figures on number of Swedish and Finnish immigrants to New Sweden during its short existence?
You would not believe how small it is. 200. There were about 200 people at the maximum. But it's helpful to put that in context. The English colony of Maryland, which was nearby, actually was also only about 200 people in the year 1650. So these were very small colonies. The thing is, their neighbors were larger. So New Netherland by 1650 actually had about 2,000 inhabitants. So that's a whole order of magnitude larger. And then if you put all of the different people in New England together, that was about 20,000. That helps explain why New Netherland was able to take over New Sweden. And of course, the later part of the story is we all know New England, well, the English Empire in general took over New Netherland. And then a large span of the Atlantic coast became English colonies.
I'm assuming by 1650, even though these colonies are very small, they're families though. It's expanded to families at this point.
That's a great point. And also, something that we need to remember when comparing them to larger Caribbean colonies at the time is that there were not very many enslaved people
Like,
in North
mm,
America. And so the dynamics were really different. It's there's a term, vast early America, that people have been using in recent years to talk about how we can expand our definition of early America, which is fantastic. And it often means bringing in the Caribbean, possibly even the whole Atlantic, into our story. But I think it's also really important to remember the things that were unique about what was happening in North America specifically.
We have a question from John. He is wondering, did Virginia apply pressure on New Sweden from the south at all during this time?
So there's actually a crazy little addition to this story that I just learned last night. There was there was a colony called New Albion. Now I knew that this existed, but I hadn't really read up on it. And so this was a tiny, tiny English colony in the area of New Sweden, Maryland. And it was actually run by Catholic people, which is really unusual in this time. We usually think of the English and Dutch and Swedish empires as Protestant empire, and that affects how we define empire and think about what it meant to people in that period. But there were some wealthy people in England who were Catholic, and there were also some wealthy people in Ireland. They contributed to this colony. New Albion is, of course, an older Latinized term for England. It did not succeed. They sent a few people, it didn't work out. They sent a couple more people, and the charters, we can find records of the charters, which are very interesting, but they did not really match what was happening on the ground. So I'd love to add that into the story more, but unfortunately, I haven't found any actual interactions where anyone in New Netherland or even New Sweden cared what the New Albion people were up to. Virginia is much more important. Virginia was a really important trading partner for all of the people I've been talking about in this story. And of course, our first thought when we hear that is tobacco, but actually, it was products in general, moving between the Chesapeake area and New England. And there are lots of Dutch people who were facilitating that trade, and lots written about that as well.
Hmm. I have a couple more questions. Um, a question about Aaron's asking, were the Swedes responsible for bringing the architectural tradition of the log cabin to America?
Oh, that is a great question. I know when people say they haven't heard of New Sweden, which happens sometimes, I always think the reason must be the Swedish immigrants to the Midwest in the 19th century who were just more numerous and so are a bigger part of Swedish heritage stories that we tell. I know there are lots of heritage stories about log cabins there, and when I was looking for material about Swedish and Scandinavian festivals in the Delaware Valley area, I found some interesting festivals happening in the Dakotas, in addition to Minnesota and Wisconsin that we might think of more easily, Iowa. Uh, but the actual first log cabin built in America, I do not know the answer, and I'd love to. If anyone happens to know who's on the call, please do put it in the chat because that would be really interesting.
Someone is saying that Swedes in the log cabin are in every high school history textbook.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so yes, they did bring it to the Americas. I'm very pleased to know that. I'm afraid my high school history textbook didn't say so.
Yeah, mine didn't either. We have another question mentioning the Dutch colonies in Indonesia. The Second Anglo-Dutch War was heavily about the Spice Islands, especially nutmeg and Banda, the only place that nutmeg grew. How important was what was going on in North America regarding the First and Second Anglo-Dutch Wars compared to the war in Indonesia?
So it depends on how we define the word important. And the overall answer is not as. Uh, Financially, really not as, because the East India companies were bringing in much, much, much more profit than any of the English North American companies or the Dutch West India Company at this time. And in fact, right before this, in 1644, the Dutch West India Company had been in such bad financial straits that there were debates about combining it with the East India Company to try to have more of a world monopoly and maybe make more profit that way. In the end, the East India Company was so opposed to the idea because of the unprofitability of the West India Company that they just gave them an infusion of 1 million guilders instead, which with
Wow.
the uh, conversion of money at the time is almost exactly 100,000 English pounds. And that's just an enormous amount of money. It's on the scale of annual tax revenue in England in these years would be in the hundreds of thousands. So that just helps show what large amounts of money were involved in the East Indies trade. Uh,
Wow.
I think, it's still interesting to talk about the North American story, but we never want to misrepresent what people were thinking about. And they were definitely more concerned about the East India companies and debates at home. Looking at the negotiations between Dutch and English negotiators before the First Anglo-Dutch War in particular, they were just so sick of each other. It's just one complaint after another. People start bringing up both the smallest issues, like a ship where an item went missing that went into port in the other place, and really old issues, including some from the 15th century that they decided hadn't been solved, and it was time now to figure that out as part of the negotiation. So at that point, you think perhaps they just were getting ready for war.
Oh, holding grudges. Ah. Well,
Oh,
thank you
yeah.
so much, Elizabeth. This was wonderful. I learned so much. We would love to have you back when your project is all wrapped up and more findings. We would love to hear all about it. Just want to end today with letting people know a couple of our upcoming events that we have. Our next Lunch and Learn is January 6th, so we have a little bit of a break over for the holidays. We will have another New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee joining us for a silent revolution, the mysterious demise of slavery in revolutionary Connecticut. And then we're doing something a little different. We have an evening virtual program on it's a book talk on the book Coffee Nation, How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States. So Michelle Craig McDonald will discuss this recently published book, and she'll talk about how coffee really has shaped the lives of enslaved laborers, farmers, merchants, and retailers, consumers, and advertisers. So it's really a comprehensive look. And then we have a program on site on January 15th, Hidden History, Native Peoples, and the American Revolution. We will watch a short excerpt from the new Ken Burns documentary, The American Revolution. And after the screening of the excerpt, we have a panel of two Native American historians that will talk about the formation of the U.S. and discuss who was entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So those are just a couple of upcoming things that we have going on. Of course, you can see all of those, all the rest on our event page at connecticutmuseum.org. And thank you everyone so much for joining us today in this busy season. I hope we see you all in January in the new year. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And let me also say thank you to both the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History and the NERFC more broadly for the financial support. It is wonderful, especially in these days when universities are having a couple financial problems. It's just wonderful when institutions want to support historical research.
Thank you. Well, we're happy to have you.
Well,
Thanks so much, everyone.
I hope to come
Bye-bye.
back and visit the museum
I
again.
hope so. Yes, let us know. We'd love to have you again. Bye, everybody.